China, Japan's largest automaker, Toyota, was revealing that the Trump tariffs will cost it $1.25 billion in earnings in April and May.
What happens when a tariff wall built to protect American industry ends up crushing the very heart of it instead? That is the unsettling question at the center of this unfolding industrial drama, one that no executive, no policymaker, and certainly no worker on the factory floor expected to confront this soon. Because behind the noise, behind the slogans, and behind the promises of revival, something far quieter and far more dangerous is taking shape. A shift so abrupt that even the most experienced analysts admit they did not see it coming. The answer begins in Kentucky, inside a factory once hailed as the beating heart of America's auto strength. For decades, Toyota's Georgetown plant represented something almost mythic: precision engineering, steady jobs, and a partnership between American labor and Japanese discipline that many believed could weather any storm. Yet today, that heartbeat is faltering. Production lines that once ran like clockwork have slowed to a crawl. Shipments that once flowed smoothly now trickle through a maze of delays. And decisions once made with confidence are suddenly overshadowed by uncertainty. At the center of this unraveling is the same structure meant to defend American manufacturing, a sweeping tariff barrier that promised to punish foreign competition and force global automakers to build American. Instead, it has created a cost spiral that no manufacturer, domestic or foreign, can escape. Toyota, the largest automaker in the world, was among the first to feel the shock. Hundreds of millions in extra costs materialized almost overnight. Critical parts became tangled in a web of new expenses, and entire product lines, including Lexus models and Toyota's best-selling RAV4, were abruptly cut back or shut down. But the truth is even sharper. This isn't just about Toyota. It's about a national gamble that has ricocheted through every corridor of American auto production. Factories across multiple states are slowing. Suppliers are shrinking. Some of the most iconic assembly hubs in the country are whispering warnings they haven't spoken since the last major industrial crisis. And while America tightens its economic defenses, something very different is happening just beyond its northern border. In Canada, the same instability that is choking U.S. factories has become a strategic opening. Instead of walls, Canada built predictability. Instead of pressure, it offered stability. And in an era of global uncertainty, that has become the rarest and most powerful industrial advantage. So here is the payoff to the opening question. The tariff wall meant to protect American manufacturing has instead pushed investment, production, and leverage away from the United States. And the country benefiting most from that miscalculation is the one watching quietly from the north. For more than 3 decades, Kentucky's industrial landscape has been defined by a single towering giant, Toyota's Georgetown plant. It wasn't just a factory. It was a symbol, an engine of stability, a showcase of cross-Pacific partnership, and a living reminder that American manufacturing could thrive when precision met discipline, when local workers and global expertise moved in harmony. If Detroit was the birthplace of America's automotive identity, then Georgetown became its second heartbeat, a place where daily rhythms were measured not by the clock, but by the pulse of assembly lines that never seemed to falter. And yet, in the span of a few short months, that pulse shifted. It didn't stop abruptly. It grew irregular, like a rhythm, struggling to hold its form under mounting pressure. Inside the complex, veterans who had worked the lines for 20, even 30 years, began noticing subtle changes long before headlines caught up. It started with delays, small at first, almost easy to ignore. A shipment arriving later than scheduled. A batch of components that cost more than expected. Conversations in the cafeteria, once filled with weekend plans and family updates, turned into quiet speculations about rising expenses and shrinking orders. Workers described the atmosphere with an uneasy metaphor. The plant felt like a long steel bridge beginning to vibrate under a growing weight, imperceptibly at first, then unavoidably. The first jolt came when Toyota halted production of the Lexus ES, an unexpected decision given how central that model was to the plant's prestige. The Lexus line was always considered the crown jewel, the place where craftsmanship and reputation converged. Shutting it down wasn't just a business adjustment. It was a signal that something deep within the system had shifted. Shortly after, word spread that the RAV4 line, one of Toyota's most consistent bestsellers in America, would be scaled back as well. Those two decisions sent a ripple through Kentucky, then across Missouri and Alabama, and finally throughout the entire network of suppliers that kept Toyota's North American ecosystem alive. Suppliers felt the shock immediately. Small parts manufacturers, those producing the unglamorous but essential components like brackets, wiring harnesses, and steel reinforcements, reported canceled orders within days. For these companies, Toyota wasn't just a client, it was oxygen. When a plant of Georgetown's size sneezed, they caught pneumonia. Local officials quietly acknowledged what the data already showed. Order volumes were falling, trucking routes were thinning, and some suppliers were contemplating temporary shutdowns. They spoke with a caution usually reserved for natural disasters. The situation wasn't loud or explosive, it was creeping, steady, silent. Logistics partners noticed it too. Freight schedules that once overflowed with outbound shipments from Toyota's sprawling complex suddenly became unpredictable. Drivers who counted on consistent weekly runs found themselves reassigned or sent home early. Warehouses that once hummed with constant movement now recorded whole afternoons of stillness. It was the kind of slowdown that doesn't announce itself with a crash, but with a long, unsettling quiet. And yet, Toyota's official message remained calm. Executives insisted that jobs were secure, that adjustments were temporary, that the plant's core workforce of more than 9,000 employees had nothing to fear. But beneath the reassuring statements, the numbers told a different story. The tariff shock, the sudden imposition of an economic barrier meant to reshape global trade, had detonated right at the center of Toyota's U.S. operations. And unlike past challenges, this wasn't one Toyota could engineer its way out of. The factory's troubles were never the result of internal inefficiency. They stemmed from something outside the plant walls, something massive, structural, and entirely beyond the control of Kentucky's workers. Every bolt, every wire, every carefully synchronized component that once flowed smoothly into Toyota's production system had been thrown into an economic storm. The Buktung Tuequan, designed to pressure foreign automakers into expanding U.S. production, had instead become a wall of costs that curved back inward. It didn't push companies to build more, it pushed them into a defensive crouch. In Georgetown, that defensive posture took the form of reduced shifts, reorganized lines, and a quiet tightening of operations. Workers who once took pride in seeing vehicles roll off the line at a steady rhythm now watched as empty gaps appeared between units. For those who understood the choreography of production, these gaps were ominous. A functioning assembly line is like a symphony, each section timed, each movement coordinated. When silence enters the score, the entire orchestra feels it. What made the situation even more unnerving was how suddenly it all happened. Months earlier, Toyota's future in Kentucky looked untouchable. Global sales were strong, and the plant was considered one of the company's crown jewels outside Japan. Workers had weathered recessions, supply shocks, even global pandemics. But this time was different. This wasn't a storm blowing in from overseas, it was turbulence created by the very environment they depended on. Local communities felt the tremors just as intensely. Restaurants near the factory saw lunchtime crowds dwindle. Rental companies that provided temporary workers recorded fewer contracts. Even local governments, which relied on steady industrial activity, began preparing for the possibility of falling revenue. The industrial machine that once served as Kentucky's stabilizing anchor was now trembling, and every institution around it was adjusting. What unfolded next revealed the deeper truth. Toyota's slowdown wasn't an isolated malfunction, it was a warning light for the entire U.S. auto sector. If the most disciplined, most cost-efficient, and most globally diversified automaker in the world could be pulled into this vortex, no one was safe. The tariff shock had not just struck foreign manufacturers, it had cracked open the foundations of America's own industrial ecosystem. And as the slowdown deepened, another story began forming just across the northern border. A story that would take this unfolding drama and flip it upside down. But inside Kentucky, the reality was clear. The first major fracture in America's automotive armor had appeared, and it appeared in a place that was never supposed to break. The shock that rippled through Kentucky did not originate from a flaw within Toyota's walls. It came from something far grander and far heavier, a sweeping economic barrier rising across the continent like a fortress built overnight. It was designed to correct an old wound, to rebalance the scales of global trade, to pressure foreign automakers into planting deeper roots on American soil. But the moment this tariff wall was raised, the ground beneath the country's auto sector began to tremble. It was as if a massive stone had been dropped into a perfectly calibrated machine, jamming every gear at once. The strategy behind this new trade frontier was simple in theory: make imported vehicles and parts more expensive, and manufacturers would be forced to produce more within the United States. But what looked like a straightforward equation on paper became something entirely different in practice. Automakers who had spent decades building delicate global supply chains suddenly found themselves confronting a cost eruption unlike anything they had seen before. Overnight, components that once flowed freely from Japan, Mexico, and Europe were burdened with surcharges that reshuffled budgets and erased years of operational optimization. The first cracks appeared in quarterly earnings shifts so sudden that executives had to revise forecasts not with caution but with outright alarm. For Toyota, the world's largest automaker, the numbers surged into the billions almost immediately. The carefully balanced ecosystem that Toyota had crafted across North America began to buckle under the pressure of tariffs applied to both finished vehicles and the thousands of individual components embedded within them. A modern car contains tens of thousands of parts, each sourced through a web of suppliers that spans continents. When tariffs touched every wire, every bracket, every circuit board, the entire architecture of North American manufacturing was pushed into a defensive position. What made the situation more paradoxical was the source of this pressure: a policy designed to revive U.S. manufacturing was weakening the very networks it aimed to strengthen. Automakers were not rushing to expand domestic factories, they were scrambling to mitigate costs. The Phao Dai Thung Mai, meant to intimidate foreign competitors, had become a labyrinth of expenses that no company could navigate without bruises. Even American manufacturers, theoretically the biggest beneficiaries of this protectionist shield, found themselves trapped within the same rising tide of raw material inflation. Steel prices surged like a tide pulled by an unseen moon. Aluminum followed, then copper, then smaller components whose costs had always been stable enough to ignore. These increases were not marginal. They cascaded through every tier of the supply chain, pushing vehicles further out of reach for consumers and tightening margins for companies already operating on thin lines of profitability. The more tariffs tightened, the more the system strained. Industry analysts describe the phenomenon as a kind of industrial whiplash, a sudden acceleration of costs that forced automakers to brake hard across all operations. Vehicles that were already in production had to be recalculated. Contracts signed months earlier were suddenly underwater. Plants across multiple states began adjusting shifts, slowing lines, and in some cases stopping entire models. The result was a production decline that felt less like a strategic adjustment and more like a continent-wide contraction. As the wall of tariffs rose higher, something else became clear. The global auto industry was not a collection of isolated national operations. It was a network, a living, responsive organism built on the assumption of interconnectedness. When one link hardened, every link felt the strain. Toyota did not only produce cars in America, it imported critical parts from Japan, exported engines from the U.S. to overseas markets, and relied on specialized components sourced through Mexico and Canada. The tariffs severed these flows with abrupt force, leaving manufacturers to either swallow the added costs or retreat strategically. And retreat they did. Toyota was not alone. Volvo trimmed its output. Audi and Mercedes re-evaluated their commitments. Even Korean brands, once seen as nimble, scaled back production or shifted operations to markets less burdened by uncertainty. What had been envisioned as a grand revival of American manufacturing instead forced automakers to consider shrinking their U.S. presence not out of defiance but out of sheer mathematical necessity. For the workers on the ground, the tariff shock felt like fog rolling into a valley, slow, quiet, and impossible to stop. Job security, once taken for granted, became a topic whispered in break rooms and parking lots. Families who had counted on stable wages began planning for reduced hours. Communities built around manufacturing hubs braced for a downturn that arrived not with layoffs, but with a slow freezing of economic momentum. The tariff wall had not just raised the cost of imported vehicles, it had created fractures across the entire North American auto architecture. Every increase in raw material cost tightened the pressure. Every disrupted supply chain added another layer of complexity. Every canceled order rippled through regions that depended on the smooth choreography of manufacturing to survive. In Washington, the narrative remained optimistic. The policy was framed as bold, necessary, and patriotic. But on the factory floor, the story looked very different. Workers understood something that political slogans could not hide. A manufacturing ecosystem cannot operate under constant strain. A chain is not strengthened by weight, it is stretched to breaking. Across the border, however, something else was forming. While the industrial machine strained under the weight of its own protective walls, Canada saw an opening, one built not through confrontation, but through quiet stability. And as the tariff shock deepened, that opening widened into an outright advantage. While the United States wrestled with the weight of its own tariff fortress, a very different story was unfolding just beyond the northern border. A story defined not by confrontation, but by calculation. Canada, long overshadowed by its larger neighbor, suddenly found itself holding an advantage it had never aggressively sought, yet was perfectly positioned to use. The chaos that gripped the American manufacturing landscape did not simply bypass Canada, it illuminated the country as the only stable landing zone left in a region shaken by unpredictable policy swings. And in the world of global manufacturing, stability is not just a virtue, it is currency. The Japanese automakers that once expanded confidently across the U.S. began looking north, not out of preference, but out of necessity. The environment in Canada was everything that the U.S. was no longer: predictable, cooperative, and shielded by a network of trade agreements designed to reduce friction, not increase it. In this climate, Canada transformed from a secondary market into what many executives quietly called a neutral industrial zone, a place where geopolitical storms lost their strength, and long-term planning was not just possible but welcomed. Honda was the first to make a move that stunned the region. In a moment when automakers were freezing expansion plans across the United States, Honda announced an investment so large it shifted the entire balance of North American manufacturing, a massive multi-billion-dollar electric vehicle and battery complex in Ontario. It was not merely a factory, it was a declaration. In an era where every major automaker must fight for relevance in the EV transition, Honda had chosen Canada as the heart of its next-generation strategy. The reasons were straightforward, yet powerful. Canada offered clean power at a consistency and scale unmatched in the region, turning energy costs from a risk into an asset. Its labor force was skilled, its regulations were clear, and its government was more willing to play a long game rather than react to short-term political storms. The incentive package supporting Honda's investment was not simply a gift, it was a strategic partnership that positioned Canada as a central player in the continent's new industrial order. Just as Honda solidified its bet, Toyota began reinforcing its own presence in Ontario. The automaker had long operated a successful network of plants in the province, but now those facilities carried new weight. With U.S. operations strained by tariffs, Canada's plants suddenly became Toyota's most efficient pathway into not only the American market, but also dozens of other regions connected through agreements like CPTPP and USMCA. Each vehicle leaving a Canadian factory could move more freely across borders, bypassing the obstacles that were choking American supply chains. Executives described Canada's trade architecture as a passport, a document that granted access to more than 50 markets without the penalty of tariff walls. At a time when the U.S. was tightening its grip, Canada extended a hand. Instead of raising barriers, it expanded corridors. Instead of imposing new costs, it offered clarity. In the global auto industry, where plants take years to plan and billions to build, that clarity was priceless. But the transformation was not happening only in boardrooms. On the ground, entire regions of Canada were shifting gears. Ontario and Windsor evolved into research and development hubs, attracting engineers, battery experts, and software specialists whose work would shape the next decade of vehicle design. Municipalities that once relied on traditional assembly jobs suddenly found themselves at the crossroads of a technological revolution. The creation of thousands of high-skilled positions signaled a nationwide recognition that the future of manufacturing was not merely in steel and engines, but in data, chemistry, and automation. The more unpredictable the U.S. landscape became, the more Canada's steady cadence stood out. International investors took notice. Uncertainty south of the border pushed them to search for new safe harbors, and Canada offered exactly that, not only in auto manufacturing, but across logistics, battery supply chains, and critical minerals. Even companies that were not yet ready to abandon the United States began quietly mapping scenarios where Canada played a larger role in their long-term strategies. It wasn't that Canada was outmaneuvering America. It was that America had stepped into its own trap, tightening the economic environment to the point where even longtime allies could no longer operate reliably. Canada did not need to compete with the U.S. in a shouting match. It simply needed to maintain its composure. Stability became its silent weapon of choice. All of this marked a rare reversal. For the first time in decades, manufacturing gravity was shifting northward. Japanese automakers, once anchors of U.S. industrial pride, were now reinforcing their Canadian operations to safeguard against volatility. Investments that might have flowed into American EV and battery development were instead fueling an industrial renaissance in Ontario. Analysts began speaking of a Canadian moment, a period where the country's long-term consistency finally eclipsed America's short-term assertiveness. And while the U.S. continued tightening its tariff walls, Canada kept its doors open, steady, and inviting. In a divided economic landscape, the quiet country to the north had discovered a new kind of power: the ability to turn calm into strategy, predictability into leverage, and stability into the foundation of a continental realignment that no one saw coming. The fractures that began inside Toyota's Kentucky plant were not isolated tremors. They were the first echoes of a deeper shift reverberating across the entire U.S. auto ecosystem. What had started as a strategic push to pressure global automakers now rippled through every corner of the supply chain, turning everyday components into contested battlegrounds and forcing companies into decisions they had not faced in decades. Workers, suppliers, carriers, and even local governments found themselves caught in a tightening web of rising costs and shrinking margins. An industrial storm moving slowly but relentlessly toward a breaking point. The modern automobile is a marvel of complexity, a machine stitched together from tens of thousands of parts sourced from across the world. For decades, this system functioned like a synchronized network of arteries, feeding a beating heart. But when tariffs surged across steel, aluminum, copper, and imported components, those arteries constricted. Prices spiked with a violence usually reserved for oil shocks or global crises. Steel climbed sharply, aluminum followed with similar force, and copper, essential for EVs and electronics, rose to levels that strained even the largest manufacturers. It was not one price spike, but an accumulation of them. A rising tide of expenses pushed up the cost of building a single vehicle by thousands of dollars before it even left the plant floor. For smaller suppliers, this new reality was suffocating. These companies operated on the thinnest margins, relying on high volume and predictable contracts to survive. When the tariff wall tightened and raw material costs surged, their balance sheets became unworkable. Hundreds of them found themselves unable to absorb the extra expenses or renegotiate terms fast enough. Some suspended operations indefinitely, others shuttered entirely. Owners who had spent decades building businesses around reliability and long-term partnerships watched their life's work crumble under a cost structure they had no power to control. The impact spread outward like a slow-moving shockwave. Plants in Michigan, Ohio, Alabama, and Missouri began adjusting production schedules. Lines that once ran 3 shifts dropped to 2 or even 1. Automakers trimmed output not because demand had disappeared, but because producing vehicles under the new cost pressure became a losing proposition. Ford and GM, icons of American manufacturing, reduced domestic production by significant percentages in the second quarter alone. Their leaders spoke carefully, but the underlying message was clear. In a system where every bolt carries a premium, even the strongest companies bend. The logistics sector, often overlooked but essential to the auto world's rhythm, felt the strain just as intensely. Auto haulers, the fleets responsible for moving newly built vehicles across the country, recorded their weakest order volumes in well over a decade. Carriers accustomed to predictable, nearly full capacity schedules suddenly found themselves idling. Warehouses, usually buzzing with inbound and outbound shipments, reported stretches of unsettling quiet. The contraction wasn't violent or dramatic, it was eerie, like a city slowly emptying out without anyone noticing at first. Behind factory gates, the slowdown manifested in ways that workers could feel but couldn't always explain. Assembly lines moved with hesitation. Inventories built up in places where they were never supposed to linger. Teams accustomed to a seamless flow of parts faced constant micro-delays, each one tiny but collectively disruptive. Workers described their shifts as dragging, not because of fatigue, but because the rhythm of the job had lost its natural pace. In manufacturing, tempo is everything. Once it falters, the entire system feels out of tune. Communities built around these industrial hubs braced for impact. Restaurants near plants saw foot traffic drop. Real estate markets softened as uncertainty clouded future hiring. Even city budgets, tied closely to industrial performance, began forecasting declines. Local leaders spoke in measured tones, trying not to spark panic, but their caution betrayed a growing concern. The slowdown wasn't temporary, it was spreading. What made the situation even more precarious was that the tariff-induced pressure did not discriminate. It hit foreign automakers and American automakers alike. It hit luxury brands, mass-market brands, and small suppliers in equal measure. Every player, regardless of size or legacy, faced the same tightening environment. The entire U.S. auto architecture was being held in place by a policy force that neither aligned with its structure nor acknowledged its complexity. And while the strain grew within the United States, Canadian operations appeared almost untouched by the turmoil. Plants in Ontario continued expanding. Suppliers survived rather than collapsed. Logistics networks operated with stability. It was as if the industrial weather system afflicting the U.S. dissipated at the border, leaving Canada in an unexpected zone of calm. Analysts began describing the divergence with a striking metaphor. America was walking deeper into a forest of thorns, while Canada had found a clearing. And inside that clearing, automakers could operate without fear of sudden shocks or unpredictable barriers. For the U.S., the most concerning reality was not the immediate slowdown, but the long-term implications. If the pressure continued, if the tariff wall remained intact, the country risked losing entire segments of its auto supply chain. Not because companies wanted to leave, but because survival demanded it. Production follows stability, investment follows clarity, and manufacturing follows places where policies remain firm rather than fluctuating. By the time this became clear to the broader public, the transformation was already underway. Factory floors were quieter, supply chains were tighter, and the industry that once symbolized American strength now found itself wrestling with the consequences of its own defensive shield. In the end, the story unfolding across North America is not merely about cars, factories, or quarterly losses. It is about a shift in industrial gravity, one created not by competition between nations, but by a single strategic miscalculation that altered the balance of an entire continent. What began as an effort to strengthen American manufacturing became a force that fractured its foundations, pushing companies, investment, and innovation into unexpected directions. And while the United States tightened its grip, Canada stepped into the opening with a calm steadiness that became its greatest advantage. The contrast between the two neighbors could not be sharper. On one side, an economy weighed down by a tariff wall that acted less like a shield and more like a tightening vice. On the other, a country that understood the value of predictability, using it as a quiet but powerful tool to attract global manufacturers searching for stable ground. In this juxtaposition, a final truth emerges. Industries do not move toward the loudest environment, they move toward the clearest one. Toyota's struggle in Kentucky, the shrinking schedules in Alabama and Missouri, the silent warehouses, the stalled assembly lines, these were not isolated episodes. They were symptoms of a broader realignment, a continental chessboard shifting pieces in slow, deliberate motion. And across that board, Canada's rise was not the result of luck or chance. It was the consequence of consistent choices, long-term planning, and a refusal to enter the storm of volatility unfolding to the south. The tariff wall built to defend American industry ended up transforming Canada into a cornerstone of North America's next industrial era. Investments that once flowed naturally into U.S. territory began landing in Ontario. R&D hubs multiplied. A new generation of workers and engineers found opportunity where uncertainty had once prevailed. By choosing stability over spectacle, Canada reshaped the future of the region's manufacturing landscape. And now, the lingering question is no longer about tariffs or short-term shocks. It is far greater. In a world where global industries depend on interconnected supply chains and long planning horizons, which type of power will define the future? Defensive walls or strategic clarity? Which economy will lead the next decade, the one that reacts loudly or the one that prepares quietly? As this chapter of the North American auto story closes, one truth stands out. Stability is no longer just an advantage. It is becoming the new symbol of strength. And the countries that understand this may very well write the next chapter of industrial dominance.